Afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel with your host, me, your reluctant prophet, Bill Reimer. I think I have an interesting one for you today, and I'll hope you'll stay with me through to the end, because if you only listen to part of it, you're not going to understand the point that I'm trying to drive home. Humans are the only creature which has been gifted with the ability to speak. Moreover, we are the only creature in creation able to use that gift to deceive ourselves and others like no other creature can. Chimps may be able to recognize other chimps' belief, which is some low form of second-order thinking. They even may use verbal deception to mislead other chimps to hide a food source they don't wish to be found. But no other creature has our level of ability to use their voice to deceive better than we humans. And the most effective deception is to make something appear to be good, desirable, innocuous, or beneficial when it isn't. It is fascinating to note that the most hyperlinked text ever created by man is the Bible. It is an invaluable source of metaphorical narratives, and it begins with such a story of deception. From Genesis chapter 3, from the King James Version, verse 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall surely not die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Verse 6. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Verse 7. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. This story contains several deceptions couched in lies. For the purpose of this discussion, let me examine, Ye shall be gods, knowing good and evil. Isn't it telling that Nietzsche stated virtually the identical thing? God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holy and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood off of us? What water is there for us to cleanse ourselves? What festivals atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear to be worthy of it? That's from The Gay Science in section 125, written by Nietzsche. With Nietzsche, we see the emergence of the transhumanist idea of creating a new man. A man capable of transcending the limitations of our humanity to become like God. From this lie proceeds all the other delusional transhumanist beliefs that will be discussed in another blog and vodcast. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I wish to focus on how the capacity for speech is used to deceive others under the guise of false flags. Such lies are invariably hidden within the metaphor of hath God said, in order to deceive the unsuspecting into buying into the lie. onto the left versus right political divide and my problem with Dr. Peterson. What is Dr. Peterson getting wrong in defining conservatism, classical liberalism, and socialism, or any other political epithet one might wish to apply to explaining the political divide? The term left versus right was coined during the French Revolution. Those who sat to the left of the king in the French National Assembly did not believe that the executive branch of government led by the king ought to have absolute power to govern, while those who sat to the right of the king believed in the divine right of kings to rule without parliamentary consent. Given that the left versus right political spectrum is a French idea, one must ask, therefore, why we choose to confuse the definition originally provided by the French, which defines the nature of limited government. No conservative, classical liberal, or libertarian believes that the executive branch of government ought to govern without parliamentary oversight. So why are they being called right-wing? Moreover, based on the evidence of our own eyes, we can see how under socialism, the socialism of the so-called welfare state, which has anything but the welfare of the citizen in mind, the absolute power of the executive branch to govern without parliamentary oversight has increased exponentially, particularly since COVID, particularly since Justin Trudeau. Why Peterson remains ignorant or confused about this fact is remarkable. But then again, he is a remarkable man, and as any man is subject to all the frailties and contradictions inherent to being a man. All of his talk of trait conscientiousness and trait openness determining our level of creativity aside, how do we know if the left has gone too far, Dr. Peterson? You ought to have asked, how do we know if the right has gone too far? Because those you are labeling as both left and right are in fact both examples of the extreme right wing, according to the original definition provided to us from the French Revolution. Let's examine language as a tool of manipulation and other such postmodern realities. Human beings will often use language couched in phrases intended consciously or unconsciously to hide a real intent. We often disguise intent in phrasing which may seem beneficial at first, but when put into practice will have negative outcomes. Let's talk honestly about the nature and origins of social collectivism. The origin of the hive mind, for instance. It is fascinating to note that it is only after the death of God, as Nietzsche put it, that the hive mind emerged on its own merit as a force for social deconstructionism. This, of course, refers to the fact that society writ large was no longer ensconced within a Christian ethos due to science and technology replacing man's need for God, or so many thought. The emergence of the Übermensch, the Superman, socialism and the Superman, how toxic ideas of transcending our evolutionary biology created socialism and all of its many offshoots, which subsequently went to war with one another. Provide the link to the article that I am now reading from now. There's no denying the socialist roots of fascism. Fascism is a form of socialism. As such, it does not engage in a fight between left and right, but between different leftist ideologies. And here's my point. All the things that Peterson is mischaracterizing as extreme left and extreme right are in fact all extreme right-wing ideologies. Socialism is a right-wing ideology. We who believe in limited constitutional government under the rule of law are all in fact left-wing because we do not believe that the executive branch of government has the absolute right to govern without parliamentary oversight. In the past few decades, there has been a deep discussion about the ideological roots of fascism, and above all, a great misunderstanding about the collectivist principles that this authoritarian movement promulgated. To understand this ideology better, it is necessary to know in depth the life, beliefs, and principles of both its political leaders, such as Benito Mussolini, and its philosophical leaders, such as Giovanni Gentili. Mussolini was a military man, journalist, and politician who was a member of the Italian Socialist Party for 14 years. In 1910, he was appointed editor of the weekly La Lotta di Classe, The Class Struggle, and the following year he published an essay entitled The Trentino is Seen by a Socialist. His journalism and political activism led him to prison, but soon after he was released. The Italian Socialist Party, increasingly strong and having achieved an important victory at the Congress of Reggio Emilia, put him in charge of the Milanese newspaper Avanti. More from this article as to why the hive mind manifests the zeitgeist of the Übermensch, or the Superman. Who is the ideological father of fascism? Practically everyone knows that Karl Marx is the ideological father of communism and socialism, and that Adam Smith is the father of capitalism and economic liberalism. Do you know, in contrast, who the mind behind fascism is? It's very likely that you don't. And I can tell you in advance that the philosopher behind fascism was also an avowed socialist. Giovanni Gentili, a neo-Hegelian philosopher, was the intellectual author of The Doctrine of Fascism, which he wrote in conjunction with Benito Mussolini. Gentili's sources of inspiration were thinkers such as Hegel, Nietzsche, and also Karl Marx. Gentili went so far as to declare fascism is a form of socialism. In fact, it is its most viable form. One of the most common reflections on this is that fascism is itself socialism based on national identity. Gentili believed that all private action should be oriented to serve society. He was against individualism. For him, there was no distinction between private and public interest. In his economic postulates, he defended compulsory state corporatism, wanting to impose an autarkic state, basically the same recipe that Hitler would use years later. A basic aspect of Gentili's logic is that liberal democracy was harmful because it was focused on the individual, which led to selfishness. He defended true democracy in which the individual should be subordinated to the state. In that sense, he promoted planned economies in which it was the government that determined what, how much, and how to produce. Gentili and another group of philosophers created the myth of socialist nationalism, in which a country was directed by a superior group, could subsist without international trade as long as all individuals submitted to the designs of the government. The aim was to create a corporate state. Life under Justin Trudeau, in other words. It must be remembered that Mussolini came from the traditional Italian Socialist Party. But due to the rupture with this traditional Marxist movement and due to the strong nationalist sentiment that prevailed at the time, the basis for creating the new National Socialism, which they called fascism, were overturned. Fascism nationalized the arms industry. However, unlike traditional socialism, it did not consider that the state should own all the means of production, but more that it should dominate them. In other words, government and private business bundled together in a fascia. That's where the word fascia comes from. The owners of industry could keep their businesses as long as they served the directives of the state. These business owners were supervised by public officials and paid high taxes. Essentially, private property was no longer a thing. It also established a tax on capital, the confiscation of goods in religious congregations, and the abolition of episcopal rents. Statism was the key to everything, thanks to the nationalist and collectivist discourse. All the efforts of the system had to be in favor of the state. Therefore, that's the end of that reading. Therefore, fascism is the antithesis of liberalism and capitalism, just as are all other forms of socialist lies inherent to the hive mind. In my story, I'm going to tell you a story now, and I provide the link to Wehrmacht, which is a hydro station up above the little village of Rjukan. As I often state, I love telling stories which personalize and give perspective to my blogging and vodcasting. When I lived in Norway, I was fascinated by the determination of the Norwegian resistance fighters to rid themselves of Nazi tyranny. It is estimated that Norway had the highest level of occupation per citizen of any country under Nazi control, at roughly 1 Nazi squarehead to 8 Norwegians. And the bastards had turned Norway into a baby-making factory to produce perfect, blonde, blue-eyed little Aryans. I detest tyranny and the jackbooted mentality indicative of the fascist Nazi version of socialism. Wehrmacht is where the squareheads were producing heavy water so that Hitler's scientists could develop a nuclear weapon. Located in the mountains of Telemark and the edge of Hardangervidda Plateau, the hydro station was ideal for producing D2O, or deuterium. It sits above the village of Rjukan, which lies in a valley on the far side of Gaustatoppen, from where my wife's cottage, or hytte, was located in Bundal Telemark. Fascinated by the idea of the resistance, I asked Anna City to drive me over Gausta to the Hydro Museum. Gaustatoppen is my favorite mountain. You can see a full quarter of Norway from his peak. Plus the fact that you can actually drive over him if you are careful to watch out for the sheep sunning themselves on the road makes the journey magical. The only way that I can describe it is that it is an otherworldly drive straight out of the Lord of the Rings. After we drove through the little village of Rjukan, hidden as it is from the sun for much of the year, since the valley in which it sits is so steep, we continued on up to Wehrmacht, where I was thrilled to see firsthand the inside of the old Hydro Museum. What had happened at Wehrmacht had helped to determine the entire future course of human history. If Hitler had managed to develop nuclear weapons, we may well have been confronted with a Reich that would have lasted 1,000 years. You can appreciate then why I wanted to understand the minds of those who fought so bravely to keep this technology out of the hands of a maniacal madman scientist, since without deuterium, the Nazis could not produce a nuclear weapon. In the depths of Wehrmacht was a workers' exhibit, which declared that many of the resistance fighters were in fact communists. There was an exhibit featuring a shrine to the Bolshevik Revolution, every bit as tyrannical and murderous as anything the Nazis ever did. I was shocked, since I had labored under the misapprehension that these men had fought to end totalitarian state control rather than over which version of it that they preferred. Boy, was I naive. And with great misgivings, I rest my case for today. All forms of social collectivism are mental pathogens, and humans are capable of hiding their real intent, couched in language that disguises their actual agenda. The hive mind is Satan's counterfeit for the individual realization of liberty that can only be experienced with a revelation of Christ. It is only in Christ that we can become fully human and fully actualized as individual members of his body, each possessed with unique gifts to serve him rather than the socialist collective. Don't let the hive mind leave you behind, believing the serpent's lies of, hath God said? These are my thoughts to think and pray about today. I was deeply saddened when I saw that shrine to the Bolshevik Revolution. And I ran up to the kids at the kiosk at the front desk and said, You've got a shrine to communism in here. How is that any better than Nazism? I thought you were a free country. And the kids looked at me like, They had no clue. They had been completely taken in and hadn't even noticed that the one thing was just as bad as the other.